Vision, where bad ideas get pulverized and the truth will set you free. Trento Vision is hosted by Tom Trento. Tom can be reached at 561-319-5533 or Tom at trentovision.tv. Listen and watch every weekday from 3 to 6 p.m. on AM 1470 WNN and trentovision.tv. Now, let's get a peek at Tom's view of the world. Here's Tom Trento.
Kenny, what's up, man? Yeah, those are good. Okay, we're back. Tom Trento, trentovision.tv, WNN 1470, 2812, 407. A lot of numbers. I have made a decision. I will announce it publicly. I have made a decision. I will announce it publicly.
Uh-oh.
I am not going to use a zero in 2013 in the address, in the date.
You go 213.
213. So if you get anything from me, it'll be dated 11213. Why do we need a zero? Think about it.
Because
yeah,
Islam gave it to us.
And they gave us this microphone and my pen and the glasses.
And the iPhone.
And I'm not going to use the zero. It's for two reasons. One, you don't need it. I mean, if I wrote 213, what would you think that is? I sent it to a friend of ours, Jerry. I sent him a note the other day. I signed it 213. He wrote back. He goes, "I think, brother, you meant," or Goomba. He actually called me Goomba. "I think, Goomba, you meant 2013." And then he goes on. He goes, "Because in 213, he gives me the whole ancient Roman history about Caligula and all this stuff." And I said, well, it takes too much time to hit that extra zero, and we don't need it. And if somebody confuses that 2013 with 213 in ancient Roman times, that's their problem.
Why do
okay?
we even need the 2 then? In that logic, why don't you just put
Well,
13?
You do when you have 1, 1, 13. But when you have all the 4, I'm only using the 3. Okay.
Okay,
So,
you really do need a cup of coffee.
yes. And what kind of coffee would that be,
Or
coffee
can
lady?
of cold coffee.
By the way, can you get me a cup of coffee?
I'm not coming to work on Monday.
I have not tried Organic Gold yet, but I will at some point.
I can quit anytime I want to. I just don't want
I
to.
have, and I will second CJ's.
It's good.
Yeah,
Organic
and
Gold.
my wife has certified it good too.
Okay,
Yeah.
there it is. One of our sponsors,
Yeah.
Organic Gold, and you too can be buzzed all day long with the another one.
It packs a punch. It packs
3
a
out of
punch.
3.
It's too much for me.
It's 3 out of 3. No, you don't want to say that. He said it's too wonderful. He said. Anyway, Tom Trento here on Trento Vision at 9 minutes past 4 o'clock. Our good friend, Dr. Andy Bostom, will be up in a couple of minutes. We're going to discuss what the heck is going on in Egypt as it relates to our subject. Is Islam compatible with the West, with the United States of America? And we are here, National Security Radio, 5 days a week, 3 to 6 every day. Repeat it infinitely in the archive section of trentovision.tv. You can watch from now until the end of time if you choose to do that, unless, of course, your computer goes down. It's a different story. And iHeartRadio, you got to get that little thing. Listen all the time. And if you're inclined in a giving way, you can help us out. Keep us on the air. Keep us fed. Keep us clothed. And keep us fighting.
Yes, please keep us clothed.
Yes. Trentovision.tv, tax-deductible donation. Get it in before the end of the year, because who knows, once we go over this cliff that President Obama is driving us over. I hope he had a good vacation in Hawaii. But, Mark, you left us on a cliffhanger. And on the Sharia piece, what were you talking about? Give us that one. University. But go ahead, what do you got from Syed Qutb?
Well, Syed Qutb actually had a lot of interesting concepts about what Islam is and what Islam isn't. And one of his main prefaces is, and the reason he became popular was because people used to call themselves Islamic. I'm Islamic, I'm Islamic, I'm Islamic. And he says, well, if you don't follow Sharia, you are not Islamic. I don't care if you call yourself Muslim or whatever. If you're not following the Sharia, you're un-Islamic. In fact, you're in what is called the House of War, Dal ar Harb. And everybody else who is following Sharia to the letter, to the law, is Islamic and is under Islam, the House of Islam. And so, and I want to stress this point. He was actually, when he came out with this manifesto called Milestones, his attack was against the Muslims who were calling themselves Muslims. He wasn't necessarily attacking the rest of society. He was actually more attacking Muslims who said, you can't call yourself Muslim. Now, Qutb later became the foundational ideological founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's where they've taken it to its state right now, where they say you must implement Sharia in your country to be considered Islamic. That's the reason they instituted Sharia law inside of Egypt.
So summing that up, Syed Qutb said, good Muslim Sharia, bad Muslim no Sharia.
Right. You can't call yourself Muslim unless you follow the
Oh,
Sharia.
it takes it even further. You're not even a Muslim.
You're not. No, in fact, you're one of the worst types of.
Okay, well,
In fact, you're an infidel. You're an apostate from Islam, is what he's called. He says you are an apostate from Islam if you don't follow Sharia.
From a Christian perspective, I run into Christians every once in a while that say, well, I'm a Christian, but Jesus Christ never existed, and he's sort of a figure, a mythical figure, and I say, well, I don't know how you can be a Christian without believing in Christ.
Christ.
Christ. How are you a Christian without believing in Christ? Well, it's the Christ idea, the Christ mindset, and then factually, as a theologian, I have to say, sorry, you're not on the team, okay? And he's saying the same thing.
Yeah, well, and it makes sense. I mean, once you understand the foundational, and he goes through it. I mean, the guy's actually a very brilliant man. I mean, he knows so much more about Islam than I do.
We'll get into Qutb quite a bit because we're going to be very factual here. But right now we got a fact person. Let's do this. We got is Mort back on the line?
No, Andy is.
Oh, I thought you said, the Mort thing you were showing me was the last time.
Yeah.
I thought he jumped back on.
No, Andy is.
Speaking of facts, we have an individual who has dedicated his life to establishing facts, and he probably knows a little bit about Syed Qutb also. He's been a guest many times on the Trento Vision show. He's been in studio, sitting right next to you right there. And he's Skyped in once he learned how to use Skype. But what can we expect from a physician? Sometimes managing those computers is a little difficult.
He's too brilliant to use the technology is the problem.
Yes, and he's the author of a couple of books that are like 1,000 pages apiece. Please, everyone, welcome once again to Trento Vision, Dr. Andy Bostom on Skype. Andy.
Hi, guys.
How are you,
Hello.
man?
Good to see you again. Good to talk to you.
Sorry we missed you when you were down in this part of the globe. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay,
Can you guys hear me?
good. Yeah. Sorry we missed you. That you were down here for a few days, I understand, over the holidays.
Yes.
Whenever you're here, we want to see you in the studio and hang out with you and just figure out how to save the world, save the West, save Israel, because a lot of saving being needed right around now. Andy, I don't know if you caught the show so far, but we're taking a look at Fjordman's article of a month or two ago where he asks the question, actually makes a statement in the question, why Islam is not compatible with the West. We're taking a little more interrogatory approach to it, asking the question to allow the evidence to establish the conclusion. And you're here. Before we get into whether or not Islam is compatible with the West, you've been doing a lot of work on the revolution in Egypt and the two votes on the 15th and 22nd. by President Mohammed Morsi. Can you give us your analysis, your view of what the heck is going on in Egypt, please?
Well, I mean, I think we have to take a step back and see how this all came about and what it, what it reflects to have a now more overtly Sharia compliant constitution compared to the 1971 constitution. How we got there. If you look at, I was actually quite surprised, depressed by a poll that was conducted by the University of Maryland in conjunction with a polling company called World Opinion. And they completed the survey at the end of 2006 into early 2007, and by late April published their results. And they surveyed, going west to east, roughly 1,000 Muslims from Morocco, Egypt, notably, Pakistan, and Indonesia. And overall, two questions jumped out that were, if you look at polls and polling data, they would have what we call internal validity. In other words, they validate each other. One question asked in broad terms about the desire to create or recreate a caliphate, some semblance of the original Islamic empire, which within a century of Muhammad's death swept across, going west to the Iberian Peninsula, to what's now Spain and Portugal, all the way east to a piece of territory that's now in Pakistan called Sindh province. So the question was about recreating that Islamic empire, the caliphate, when you looked at the pooled results from these four countries, and again, they're very important countries because Morocco and Egypt are prototypical Arab Muslim countries, Egypt being the largest Arab Muslim country, and Pakistan and Egypt are non-Arab Muslim countries of enormous size, particularly Indonesia. It's one of the larger countries in the world, but it certainly has the biggest Muslim population. So in pooling these data, 2/3 wanted the recreation of a caliphate. And the concordant question was 2/3 also, and the word was strict, wanted strict application of the Sharia. Now, getting back to Egypt, when you broke the data down for Egypt specifically, so that was 1/4 of the sample, 67% wanted the recreation of a caliphate, and 74% wanted strict application of the Sharia. So this is all the way back in April, it was reported in April of 2007. If you look at data of the Egyptian population, which began to look at some of the specific punishments under the Sharia has these so-called had punishments, these required punishments, things like amputation, mutilating punishments for theft, stoning adulterers to death, killing apostates, those who leave Islam. Pew published data which were perhaps even more alarming, which, again, going in ascending order, 77% of Egyptians in a poll from Pew in 2010 believed in mutilating punishments for thieves. 82% believed in stoning adulterers to death, and 84% believed in killing apostates. So I'm giving you all these numbers because these questions bear, I think, very heavily, and connections are not made nearly enough by the media, even amongst conservative media, that these are the bedrock longings of the Egyptian population that eventually became translated into the parliamentary elections. And then the parliament, of course, the House was charged with formulating this more Sharia-compliant constitution, which now almost 2/3 of the Egyptian population has voted in favor of. So this does not come out of a vacuum. This is not the evil machinations of the Muslim Brotherhood. They may exploit sentiments like this, and they certainly share these sentiments.
Hey, Andy, can you hear me okay?
But
Hey, Andy,
ultimately,
Andy, can you hear me?
yeah.
All right, let me establish for the audience here. It's very important. At 21 minutes after 4 o'clock on our show, TrentoVision.tv, WNN on broadcasting on the radio, WNN 1470 at 22 minutes past 4 o'clock East Coast time. We are discussing the general topic of whether or not Islam is compatible with the West, with America. Specifically now, we have Dr. Andrew Bostom with us, and we've asked him to do an analysis of the Egyptian election and what that means. And we need to establish that you're an epidemiologist, correct?
Yeah. That in medicine, that was one of the hats I wore. I'm an internist, and I conduct clinical trials. But yes, my training is also in epidemiology.
Yeah, and you are a researcher. You collect data. You analyze it. This is what you do for a living. You have written 3 books: The Legacy of Jihad, Islamic Holy War, and the Fate of Non-Muslims. How many pages was that little primer?
I think it was around. I don't know. They're all in the 750 range.
The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, and the latest one, Sharia versus Freedom: The Legacy of Islamic Totalitarian. What is the word?
Totalitarianism.
Oh, on your blog, it's
Superfragilistic espialidocious.
on your blog. You're missing some letters. I will make you aware of that right now. I thought you wrote a new word there. It's the M dropped off. Totalitarianism.
Blame it on the web guy.
Okay, but for the sake of, if I were in a courtroom right now, I just established you as an expert witness to discuss these issues. And we're doing that today factually. Number 2, after establishing your credibility, we have had some guests on here, lovely people, and one in particular, an Egyptian exile woman, Cynthia Farahat, who takes exception with the data and says, because of her experience there, that in a totalitarian regime, whether it's the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, Russia, whatever, you cannot get accurate data because everybody's afraid to speak up. How do you address that issue?
Well, I don't see what it has to do with asking people during a private survey face to face whether they abide attitudes that are remarkably popular, as I pointed out, not just in Egypt, but across the length and breadth of the Muslim world. Is she going to argue that when we've had survey data in this country by a group called Wenzel Associates? Now, what they did, this was only published a couple of months ago. This is American Muslims, actually very successful American Muslims. It turns out they went off commercial trade lists that are available. I guess they're via advertisers, etc., that need demographic data on populations, and they looked at the Muslim sounding surnames. They narrowed it down with interviews to make sure that it was in fact the Muslim population, and they came up with a sample of 600 Muslims across the United States. Now, it wasn't a random sample. There are all kinds of methods to get random samples. The government does this all the time. I was part of some of these surveys. It's called random digit dialing. They didn't do it that way. They did it. It's more of a convenient sample. But it was a highly educated sample of 600 U.S. Muslims, successful financially. And 58% of them rejected the First Amendment. In other words, they felt that people should be punished for criticizing Islam or Muhammad. Now, what kind of duress were these people under? I don't really understand her point when it comes to survey data that are then borne out by a constitutional referendum, or prior to that, a parliamentary election. It just doesn't make any sense to me. I understand her heart, and where she would like to see the country go. But I think she's letting her sentiments get ahead of where the data go. I'll give you another piece of data about a few days, about a week before the first round of the constitutional referendum took place. So this was December 8th. The first round was December 15th. Egypt's universities participate in something called Vote Compass, which was it's software that was developed originally, I believe, at the University of Toronto, and it's made for individuals to register their opinions on various political issues, and it's private. In other words, people do this in the privacy of their own home, and they predicted a week before the first round of the referendum. The numbers were slightly off, but pretty close. They predicted that the referendum was going to pass with 70% approval. With all due respect to Cynthia Farrahat, whose sentiments I share in terms of what she would like to see happen in Egypt, I think this is sort of delusive argumentation in light of the reams of data.
Okay, and maybe we'll have you guys on together sometime. And the data, we have to follow the data. There is a psychological strength to the argument that people are suppressed. But Mark was just saying, people in totalitarian regimes, Mark was just saying, we've run these surveys here in the United States where nobody's suppressed about anything.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's when Dell Associates was 600 U.S. Muslims. Now, you can argue that it was a convenient sample, that it wasn't, a truly representative sample of the entire population of U.S. Muslims done by, standardized random digit dialing techniques, and that's true. But that type of study in this country would cost millions and millions of dollars. This was done the way some of these surveys are done, using a more convenient sampling methodology off trade lists. But still, if anything, you got to look at what would the bias be in a sample like the U.S. Muslim sample. If anything, you would think it would be biased towards more progressive thought, etc. After all, it was more educated and higher socioeconomic status individuals, and yet 58% of them don't believe in freedom of speech.
Well, the best survey data that I have seen yet, here's your data right here. The best survey data I've seen yet is the scores and scores of places the United West and the people we work with have been to, whether they're college campuses or protests or whatever, in the Islamic world, talking to these people, college students. I remember in that one video out of UCSD, University of California at San Diego, where David Horowitz was speaking, and the woman says, do you want, when David said to the woman, would you like all the Jews to go back to Israel so you can kill us all there all together? She goes, yes, I would like that. This is at UCSD. We've been on those campuses. So our personal anecdotal experience can validate the studies that have been done.
But actually, if you ask the majority of students there who aren't Muslim, they probably would agree with that as well.
And here's the quintessential example. Here's the quintessential example. Mohammed Morsi. He was trained in the U.S., educated in the U.S., got his Ph.D. in the U.S. That was all westernized. The ultimate success of U.S. Islamic integration and education and lovey-dovey stuff, and he's elected the president of Egypt, and the first thing he does is implement Sharia law. Now, how much more, real life data do you need?
And we've established that. Now, what's going to happen in Israel? And it looks like there's a ring of Sharia fire around Israel. What's going to happen in Egypt? Give us some predictions or some observations.
Well, whether the regimes are secular leaning or now as they're moving towards more traditionalist Islamic regimes, and after all, as Tom knows, I have a very, very long piece that I researched over the last few weeks, and it was published Christmas Eve Day on our abetting the Muslim Brotherhood-dominated coalition that's probably going to succeed the Assad regime when he's finally toppled. There could be a lot more blood spilled before that happens, but there's the likelihood that Syria will be a Muslim Brotherhood state, and when that eventually happens, it's quite possible the same could happen in Jordan. So you would literally have all the major countries on Israel's borders being run by the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood has never shied away since its founding from what its desires are for the Zionist entity. It doesn't, according to Islamic theopolitics, the notion of any non-Muslim minority community reasserting sovereignty over its ancestral homeland is just anathema. It's not something that can be abided under the institution of jihad. Once an area is conquered by Islam, it is permanently part of the Dar al-Islam. And so any dhimmi community, any non-Muslim minority community under the Sharia that throws it off, this is a terrible circumstance. And so obviously Israel represents that, and so would there's been talk of the Copts having their own enclave. This did in fact happen with southern Sudan. It was one of the designs for Lebanon as an enclave for Middle Eastern Christians. So Israel is not unique in that respect, other than having actually succeeded. So it according to Islamic doctrine, it needs to be destroyed by jihad and fully re-Islamized. And whatever Jews might survive by the good graces of the victorious and Muslim overlords could go back to living as dhimmi, as subjugated non-Muslims under the Sharia.
Andy?
Okay.
Yeah, I want to ask a question to you, and this is very quintessential. Very poignant to what we're talking about today. Can you mentioned the word Dar al-Islam, and the converse of that is Dar al-Harb. Can you be in the house of Islam? Can you be considered Islamic if you do not follow the Sharia law? Is that possible?
In theory, no. In practice, well, as Yogi Berra once said, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. Look, there are contingencies that were made, for example, for the Alawites. Khomeini, as I recall, actually wrote a fatwa, an Islamic religious ruling, that gave them a legitimacy that they might not have otherwise had, particularly the Papa Assad, Hafiz al-Assad. And now the Alawites are a Shiite-derived sect, but they also embrace elements of Christianity. So they're very, very heterodox, and it was not a sect that by any means is a traditional classical Islamic sect, let alone not Sunnis for sure, and not even Shiite. And so but that contingency was made via fatwa because of political reasons. So these things can happen. So and you have seen, look, there's the impact of international law. The only international law in Islam is the law of jihad, which obviously runs afoul of modern conceptions of international law, and yet by virtue of the strength of non-Muslim countries and alliances, there's a certain grudging acceptance of that reality.
I want to qualify my question. You're talking about the fringes. Yes, there are some fringes which they can call themselves Islamic, but I'm talking about in general, in the majority. for example, the Muslim Brotherhood doctrine, followed by Sayyid Qutb as the founder. Can you be Islamic without following Islamic law? And we know that the Muslim Brotherhood groups are the leaders here in America of the Sayyid Qutb doctrine. Can you be Islamic, considered Islamic, without following Sharia?
In a traditional sense, no. In a traditional sense, no. Whether you're Shiite or Sunni, no.
Andy,
the Sharia is the quintessence of Islam and of being a Muslim.
all right, Andy, a couple of things. I got a question, and CJ has a question. Then we're going to go into Fjordman's article here. I hear this term a lot, and even from some of our colleagues. And I watched a presentation last night by Daniel Pipes, and he uses the term. I don't know the definition. Maybe you could help me understand the definition of Islamism. What does Islamism mean?
It doesn't mean anything to me. As a matter of fact, I've written about this. Up until at most 50 years ago, Islamism and Islam were absolutely synonymous. In other words, the way you would refer to Judaism or Catholicism or Protestantism was you would refer to Islam and Islamism synonymously. You'll even see terms when you begin to have this very pronounced Islamic revival, and there's been multiple incarnations of these revivals, but the one that we're probably still living with begins after the Russo-Turkish War and a rather humiliating defeat by Turkey. The movement to reaffirm a stronger international Islamic movement was referred to as Pan-Islamism. Now they didn't mean what Daniel Pipes means. They just meant
Right.
The traditional hegemonic aspirations of Islam. So it's interesting. People will cite this quote by Erdogan and then still refer to him as an Islamist, which just I
Right.
find incredible. But he says Islam is Islam and that's it.
Yeah.
And then people, but he's an Islamist. So I don't really use this terminology. I think Islam is, as the Prime Minister of Turkey put it, and I don't find it very helpful.
Yeah, but people that are using it,
Islam,
the people that are using it, like Daniel Pipes, who's a wonderful, brilliant leader in this movement. What point are they trying to make?
I think they're trying. At one level, they're imposing something that's a Western concept, because you'll also see that supposedly Islamism is synonymous with quote political Islam, but again, it's a Western distinction that it really, in some still entrenched and fundamental ways, does not exist in the Islamic world, which is the idea that religion and politics can be neatly separated. Islam is a very, very political faith without having to coin a word like Islamism, and it just doesn't make much sense. It may make sense conceptually to think about it. Then the other argument is made that non-Islamist Muslims are those who don't believe in imposing the Sharia, and but particularly in the diaspora. So those that are living in the United States or Western Europe or Australia, et cetera, that just want to live and let live, and accept living in a non-Sharia based society. That we should call those people non-Islamist Muslims.
Right.
And so I guess that's that's where this distinction comes about. But again, it's a completely Western conception, and unfortunately, what we're seeing is that more and more of the Muslim diaspora population is becoming what I would just call traditionalist in its views, and wanting to assert as much as they can, at least, of the Sharia within these wholly non-Islamic societies.
Right. Right.
All right, CJ, you have a question?
Yeah. Relating to all of this and doing definitions, I think that people like Daniel Pipes and others are using Islamism when they really want to say jihadis, but they don't want to say jihadi, and really a traditional practicing Muslim who advocates Sharia has to advocate for jihad, and therefore is a jihadi. And could you define what the jihad is and its relationship to Islam as being one of the core pillars of responsibility for a Muslim who is Sharia compliant? What does that mean?
And the same question, just in different format, is Sharia, if you follow Sharia, are you a jihadist?
Yeah, you are, by definition.
Well, the whole doctrine of jihad as an institution, is, of course, yes, and of the Sharia.
Say that again.
The jurisprudence of jihad is extensive, and it is noble. It is intrinsic. So yeah, they are inseparable.
So there is no difference between a person who follows Sharia and a jihadist.
Not in the way we would look at it. Now again, if you're going to define, it depends how narrowly you want to define jihad. If jihad is just, purely being actively involved in a military campaign, then the fighters. So, for example, we go back to Syria. Unfortunately, the most effective fighters against the Assad regime are those that would be recognizable, to Daniel Pipes as classical jihadists, warriors. They happen to be Al-Qaeda affiliates, et cetera, et cetera. But I would argue, and I think Daniel would also, that the Muslim Brotherhood is a jihadist movement.
Of course, that's the point we're trying to make.
Even when it's not actively engaged in supporting a specific military brigade or
exactly.
Brigades.
You don't have to be an actual soldier, and you don't have to actually be trying to kill somebody yourself to be considered as following the path of the jihad, according to Islam
the ultimate
itself.
Aim of jihad, whether it's waged by violent means or economic means,
and in fact, their charitable giving
or propaganda
makes them
or proselytizing, is to Islamize a society.
Yes, thank you.
And impose the Sharia.
Or the jizya which they give to...
the zakat.
Zakat. Zakat which they give, as donations, which go directly, as 1/7 of it says, to jihad.
Exactly.
Which
so
I'm
going to read...
serves the traditional purposes that we would think of, in the non-Muslim world, charity, et cetera, but
yes.
But it also is very openly to fund the active fighters.
Andy, this is Tom. I want to get your thoughts on Fjordman's couple of statements he makes in his article. He actually wrote this in September. It's entitled "Why Islam Does Not Belong in the Western World." It's 45 minutes past 4 o'clock on WNN 1470.
Interesting
Trento Vision.
comments on that article, by the way.
Yeah. 45 minutes past 4 on the 28th of December. You're on Trento Vision on the video side. On the radio side, you're in Boca Raton, WNN 1470. But if you're listening on the radio, you could be anywhere in South Florida, almost all the way from Miami to Orlando. You're listening to Tom, CJ, Mike, Mark, and our special guest, Dr. Andy Boston, from somewhere in the Northeast. Cold up there today, Andy?
Yeah, it's right around freezing.
Right around freezing, good. Better you than us, but here's what...
Yeah, because it's 77 degrees.
Here's what Fjordman said.
My Huskies love it.
Oh, okay, yeah, they would. He said, Islam means submission, If you are not willing to submit to Islam or Islamic rule, then Islam is your mortal enemy. Always has been, always will be. Yes, Islam itself, not radical Islam, not militant Islam,
Yeah.
or evildoers abusing the peaceful teachings of the Quran. Islam. Then he goes on to say, Islamic culture is incompatible with all the best aspects of European civilization. No form of Islam, as it exists today, belongs in any Western country.
Yeah, it's given the evidence, not only from, and you do have to look at this evidence, given the evidence of what's going on in Islamic societies, and understanding how the Muslim community views itself as a global community, just in theory, and thinking again about Yogi Berra's reminder, but then looking at the movement to Islamize, impose Sharia, even if it's patiently and incrementally and via, the bully pulpit of political correctness in non-Muslim societies, it's hard to argue with what Fjordman has said. It doesn't mean that there aren't more secularized minority currents. Again, people that want to own a grocery store because they can earn a living in a non-Muslim country and enjoy the benefits of the lifestyle. Doesn't mean that there are people that are living in Western societies that don't buy into this traditional program. But increasingly, it's become more and more evident that those kinds of people are really in the minority, and a shrinking minority too. So it's hard to argue with what he's laid out there, and in a very clear and honest way.
Well, do you think that
Okay.
some of these people who are, the grocery store owners, and they do just want to have, the better way of life here in the West and everything else, they start out that way, but then they actually become strict and compliant through pressure within their own communities,
Well, you put
by
it, you point,
the
yes,
imams
yes, that is the nub of the problem. Because again, even if individuals can benefit from the openness of our societies, if institutional Islam in the West is now basically mimicking institutional Islam in Islamdom, then you're right. Then people who would potentially be very, unfortunately we're having less and less of a melting pot in general, but let's just assume we still had more of a melting pot. People that would be inclined to just melt in like previous generations of immigrants,
yeah,
are being pulled. And here, institutional Islam is a major problem, but we're also a major problem. I mean, the cultural relativism, the multicultural ethos is making problems like this worse, not just for Muslim communities, but for all kinds of communities. But again, the Islamic community is particularly susceptible to this because of their own institutions. And,
all right, Andy.
and so we see, mosque survey data, for example, the Yerushalmi Kedar study that you guys are familiar with, that was actually published by Daniel Pipe's journal, the Middle East Quarterly, showing that 81% of U.S. mosques are fomenting cultural, at least, jihadism, and this is a toxic environment that would oppose the integration, liberalization of the Muslim immigrant community.
All right, Andy, we only have a few minutes left, and everybody wants to ask questions here, but I'm trying to lay a foundation for our next hour because we're going to lose Andy in a few minutes.
Oh.
So let me just throw a couple of quick things out, which will help us with the next hour.
Okay.
Fjordman, in his article, goes on to analyze whether or not Islam can be reformed, compares it to the Protestant Reformation, and he concludes that it can't in any way be reformed as we understand Reformation. He says, then if you believe this analysis is correct, you're left with only one possible conclusion. We must physically separate ourselves from Islam and Islamic culture as much as is practically possible. And he goes on to say, Lawrence Auster dubbed this separationism, which is not a bad term. What is your thought about that?
Yeah, I think the last 50, 60 years of certainly U.S. interactions are further evidence that that as unpleasant and as unpalatable it may be to our current sort of politically correct way of seeing things, that again the evidence would support Fjordman's argument that there's been multiple reformations in Islam. Islam doesn't need a reformation. Islam never went through what the West experienced, even in terms of the Renaissance and the upholding of the individual, let alone an enlightenment. And obviously there are routes out of the Enlightenment that can lead to bad things too. But Islam doesn't need any more reformation. We're, like I said, I think we're living through a reformation that took place 50 years before the Muslim Brotherhood, movement arose. There was already a big caliphate revival movement which came out of India primarily, and the biggest rallies opposing the Balfour Declaration, again because that was more than a decade before the Muslim Brotherhood arose, right? Were based in pre-partition India. Islam has had multiple iterations of reformation.
All right, one last question.
It's done nothing to celebrate the individual or the enlightenment.
One last question, then we're out of time here. What about the good little Muslim person, and we all know and have dealt with these folks?
10% to jihad?
No. that just wants to get out of all that nonsense, come to the United States, kind of, pray 5 times a day, whatever. They want nothing to do with any of the crazy stuff. Do they have a role in the United States of America?
It's becoming increasingly dubious to justify that, given what institutional Islam is in the United States. I have a big problem with that. It sounds great conceptually. There are people that divorce themselves from institutional Islam in America and find some path. But the idea of encouraging this kind of mass movement, particularly when if we're going to encourage anyone to come, we should be encouraging all the minority populations that are being brutalized in these Islamic countries. Like the Copts, for example, in Egypt. But there are Christian populations across the length and breadth of the Islamic world that should be granted refugee status well ahead of Muslims themselves.
All right, Dr. Andy Boston, we thank you for taking time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Great.
We know you're not.
You're welcome.
We know you're not feeling too well, but you hung in there with us.
Time to get back into bed.
Okay. We
Feel
really
better,
appreciate it.
And Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. You take care. And all right, now Andy sort of laid a foundation for our discussion in the next hour.
Yeah.
And we will be back in just a few moments and continue with the question: is Islam compatible with the West?